it doesn't surprise me that yet again, important Hamas terrorist targets are hiding behind women, children, civilians, like cowards. Just like in this situation related to this recent airstrike that struck a refugee camp in Gaza. Let's listen to what the lieutenant has to say to Wolf Blitzer on CNN.
Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for joining us. First, on this Israeli strike on the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Gaza. Is taking out one Hamas leader inside that camp and possibly some other Hamas targets, is it worth the deaths of a large number of innocent Palestinians, many of them women and children?
All right. So did anyone hear any mistake in the way Wolf Blitzer just asked that question? Any mistakes, or do you think it was a reasonable question? Let's listen to it again.
Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for joining us. First, on this Israeli strike on the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Gaza. Is taking out one Hamas leader inside that camp and possibly some other Hamas targets, is it worth the deaths of a large number of innocent Palestinians, many of them women and children?
A large number of Palestinian citizens, many of them women and children. Where's he getting that information from? Does he have a number? Or is this just theater for the news?
Hello, Wolf. Thank you for having me on the show. I would exercise a lot of caution relying on reports coming out of Gaza. I remember how the event in the Al Ahli hospital in Gaza City started with reports of 500 dead and then 800 dead. And I know how it ended. We were blamed for killing many Palestinian civilians then, but it later became apparent what had happened, and it also became apparent that the number of civilian casualties was greatly inflated by all of the so-called authorities in Gaza, which is basically saying Hamas. Now, I'm not saying that there are no civilian casualties. What I am saying is that we struck an important military objective. This Ibrahim Briari, who was a battalion commander who was leading operations and fighting against Israel as he was targeted. He and many dozens of enemy combatants were in a tunnel complex underneath the ground. We struck that tunnel complex and that caused it to collapse. And it is our assessment that dozens of Hamas operatives were killed. Those are casualties that should be factored in any report of casualties coming out of the Gaza Strip. And I also understand that there is significant structural damage around, and that is because Hamas built that vast tunnel complex underneath the buildings, and it probably collapsed as a result of the strike. We have to put into context that this is the same area, northern Gaza, that we have been asking Palestinian civilians, non-combatants, to evacuate for almost 2 weeks. Most Palestinians have. But I really ask and would want to understand, why have Palestinian civilians either been forced or chosen to remain in that area in direct risk of their own lives? They should move to the south. They should not be in a war zone, in a main combat area. And it's not too late to call on all Palestinian civilians in northern Gaza, please evacuate to a safer area in the south, because northern Gaza is an active combat zone and Hamas uses civilians as their human shields. Today's event is a clear example of it.
Yeah, so what are the reasons you think these civilians are still occupying these areas when they've been warned to get out? This has been a problem since the beginning of this renewal of this conflict with the terrorist attack on October 7th. Hamas doesn't care about these civilian deaths, obviously. Why would they build a military operation base under the biggest refugee camp in Gaza? Why would they do that? Well, they thought that they would be safe. But it seems like the IDF was successful in killing many Hamas terrorists with this blast, and we will have to see how many casualties were suffered because of this. Now, when talking about war and war strategy, things can start feeling very disgusting quite quickly. When we start saying civilian casualties, it kind of feels like we're saying they're expendable or their lives don't matter. Every death in a war matters. Whether it's a soldier dying, whether it's a child dying. The way they die, the intent behind that death, those things are very important. There are good ways of conducting war and bad ways of conducting war. That does not mean that the deaths that result from the good ways of conducting war are going to be good deaths. And it also doesn't mean that the bad ways of conducting war are going to result in more deaths than the good ways of conducting war. War is a disgustingly brutal, nasty, terrible thing. But I believe that war can become necessary. In this situation, I think it is necessary. This terrorist regime needs to be uprooted, and those that do survive during this process, those criminals that are responsible for the butchering and killing of innocent civilians, specifically targeting innocent civilians on October 7th, they should be brought to justice for their actions. And in these situations, I always do hope they capture more of these terrorists than they kill. Let's hear more from the report.
Lieutenant Colonel, all of us have now seen the pictures, the widespread destruction in that refugee camp. Even if Israel was trying to target Hamas underground tunnels, as you say, this refugee camp was massively hit. Doesn't Israel still have a responsibility to try to avoid civilian casualties, even if Hamas is among them? How can Israel say it's minimizing civilian deaths right now when Israel went in, bombed that refugee camp, presumably killing some Hamas leadership, but also in the process killing a lot of women and children?
Again, Wolf, you keep repeating women and children, all of that. We haven't...
Yeah, Wolf said a lot of women and children again. And did you hear the colorful language he was using? Massive, these argument from emotion type appeals.
We haven't seen confirmed numbers of it. We're seeing reports coming out of a party to the conflict. I have not seen confirmed numbers of any of the civilian casualties. I understand that there may be, but I would recommend caution when claiming that they have been killed. And we've seen this in the past, where many times it takes weeks and even more to really understand who was killed in any specific activity. And I think that we should be cautious when claiming that there were non-combatant casualties. We issued video of the strike, and in that video everybody can see clearly that our bombs struck in between the buildings, not on buildings but in between the buildings, because we were aiming for the tunnel complex where the Hamas combatant commander was. We didn't strike buildings. If we would try to strike buildings and cause civilian death, of course the situation would be different, but we are not. And we continue to operate according to the laws of armed conflict. We continue to distinguish. We continue to use proportionate force and use the least amount of force that we can do in order to achieve the military objective. This case was an important military objective. A senior Hamas operative, commander, and dozens of Hamas combatants That is why we struck the area, and we will have to continue to look into the information coming out and verify the information and understand how many of those dead are combatants and how many were not. And I wouldn't want to rush into conclusions and immediately say that there were lots of non-combatants. We know of dozens of Hamas combatants that were killed. And I think we should be careful when reporting about it.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conriquez will continue this conversation down the road for sure. Thank you once again for spending a few moments with us.
Do you think Wolf Blitzer will incorporate any of that interview into trying to be better next time? Because the guy's been around for a long time, and that had to be one of the shittiest interviews I've ever seen conducted. Just trying to blow things out of proportion. And this is he's in this arena, and he's just talking to a lieutenant that's absolutely just sniffing all the bullshit that Wolf Blitzer's laying out in his questioning. I think the lieutenant looked quite well in that interview, and it looks like they achieved their objective, and I do hope that civilian casualties were minimized. Hopefully none. We can dream.